Thank you very much for your very informative and strong talk on this subject. Okay, I've got three very quick questions. Okay, Malcolm Turnbull dismissed the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the notion of establishing a First Nations voice in Parliament, the Australian Parliament, as in conflict with universal values of equality and citizenship. Your response to that. And I was reading an article by John Pilger on white supremacy and genocide in Australia, and he writes, "When I began filming Indigenous Australia some 30 years ago, a global campaign was underway to end apartheid in South Africa. I was struck by the similarity between the two countries, South Africa and Australia, in relation to white supremacy. For example, black incarceration in Australia is greater than that of black people in South Africa during the apartheid era. Indigenous people go to prison, are beaten, and die in custody as a matter of course. In despairing communities, children as young as 10 take their own lives. Yet no international condemnation, no boycotts have disturbed the surface of lucky Australia. When will that occur? And also, what is where does white supremacy and racism intersect with social class?"
I can respond quickly to the first one. It's the Uluru Statement. Turnbull stated that would make a third chamber of parliament, which was totally inaccurate, totally false. He was called out on that on the Q&A program, but he still insisted it'd make a third chamber. What was being asked was that an advisory body be elected to advise the government. An advisory body is not a third chamber, a parliament chamber. It's like me advising anybody here that you might need a new haircut. You can take that advice or you don't take that advice. And so he purposely misled the whole thing. The thing of the Uluru Statement is very controversial amongst us ourselves because it seems the extension, it's pushing recognition. In excess of 80% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people were against constitutional recognition. I predicted some years ago that the government would not forge ahead with recognition, that it was just another thing to distract what was really happening in this country. They never meant to go ahead with recognition. Turnbull proved that because as soon as people went off program with what he said recognition was, he just bang, jumped it on the head. The next question was boycotting Australia. Well, well, I don't know why that hasn't happened. If you look now, for many years since I've been recording, for many, many years now, the United Nations have received so many complaints about this country. It's got to the point now, I was watching Channel 2 the other night, the comedy festival, Edinburgh. A Scottish comedian was talking about racism, and he said, if I want to be subjected to racism, I'll go to Australia, at least I'll have the sunshine as well. So, you know, we're becoming an international joke. A Bolivian newspaper wrote that Australia is being run by idiots, racist idiots. Berlin has been out on protests every time we go on protests against closing down communities. So we've got a lot of international press that are saying things. The only press that isn't giving it to this country is the local press. But the overseas press are really hard on us. So I don't know, I think there should be a boycott on this country until they actually start attempting to give us self-determination. That's what has to happen in this country. I'll let you go on the class one.
Oh, thank you so much.
You got the good one.
Thank you. This is my pet topic. It's very simple, right? We can't look at race, class, or gender in isolation from each other. So we need an intersectional approach to these things. And there's one very basic thing. When people say, you know, talking too much about racism or talking too much about gender takes the focus away from class, what they really mean is that they associate class with white people. And they don't understand that the majority of the working class, such as it is these days, right? People who work and earn, you know, minimum wage or even poverty wages are black and brown people, right? And so class is a race issue and race is a class issue. And we need to always be very we need to always question why we're asking, what about class? What do you mean? What's the underlying, not you personally, but why do people want to know what about class? And the assumption usually is a racist one.
Thank you very much, as usual, Ken and Alana. The question is with regard to the framework of human rights. We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the UN. We even have an international criminal court designed to go after violators of human rights crossing borders. Now, despite all those attempts, despite all that rhetoric and human rights, we still have such violations, and they seem quite selective. It seems like human rights seems to be applied to humans we like to apply these rights to. How would you think, how would we reform the framework of human rights to make it finally work? Would you think an international convention would be necessary? Do you think Australia needs a Bill of Rights?
I think we certainly need international intervention. I've said that for some time. We do need an intervention in this country. We need to have governments stay away from Aboriginal people, and we need to have self-governments. But to have that, we need to have overseas bodies on the ground here, witnessing what happens day to day. It's all right to have, we're signatories to the international rights of Indigenous peoples, but we were dragged screaming and kicking to the table to sign it. We are not signatories to treaties which outlaw genocide. In actual fact, genocide is not illegal in Australia. It's not illegal. We are not, a lot of the war crimes commissions around the world, particularly in Hague, we are not signatories to those organisations, so Australia cannot be answerable to some of the what we call war crimes. We have a group of people now working towards going to The Hague to take this government and previous governments. But the thing they're finding more and more is that Australia refuses to sign any international treaties which outlaws the human rights abuses of First Nations peoples. So you might want to add to that.
I'm a bit pessimistic about all of those structures because they rely on ideas of liberal governance, which I very briefly mentioned, are racialized at their core. So I don't really have time to go into the theory and the history of that in great detail, but you have to understand that ideas of race grew up in parallel to ideas of liberal governance, and they're predicated on the idea that European systems of governance are good for the entire world, right? And that all we have to do is roll those systems out across the world and all will be right. So if that's at the heart of the premise of an organization like the United Nations, with all the best will in the world, is a white supremacist organization in and of itself. So you had the non-aligned movement in the 1950s, and it was killed. But literally, its leaders were killed, right? And what you really need, and we're in a different era today, you need a new kind of non-aligned movement, and you could have that through the hooking up of Indigenous peoples and racialized peoples and other anti-racist peoples from different countries across the world working together. So just one thing that I'm aware of that I'm actually attending in Paris in May, they're calling it the Bandung of the Global North. So they're having a new Bandung conference. And it's, you know, uniting black and brown people from different countries to start a conversation about what a new non-aligned movement would look like. And that kind of initiative I find really fascinating. And that's where I would put my hope rather than in the international institutions, which I see as basically corrupt.
G'day, yeah, Brian Concannon. I was just wondering, Four Corners and Q&A both had stories this week on mass immigration. And I was wondering if you think it's racist to demand we have proper infrastructure before we allow mass immigration, seeing our roads, schools, etc. can't cope as it is. And also, Ken, you were saying you're in Boggo Road. I'm just curious, were you set up? And Alana, I'm just wondering, do you believe anti-Semitism is sometimes used as a desperate defence to hide the truth?
I'll answer the Boggo Road one first. No, in a way I wasn't, but I declared when I was 18 that I was a prisoner of war, and that naively I said armed robbery was an act of war, that I was only taking what they stole from me, and I was attacking their God, this was my defence. I was attacking their God, which was money. So I got a long sentence for it, but anyway. But some of the methods with I was caught, yes, I got found guilty on what they call a police verbal. There was no physical evidence against me whatsoever, but I don't sort of dwell on that because you know, I did 9.5 years. That's fine, but I politicised myself in there, and I don't dwell on that. I dwell on what I learnt from it. You know, it was a hard thing to learn, but I learnt something from it. As far as being set up, yeah, I knew I wasn't that stupid that if you start sticking up banks and that, you're going to go to jail eventually. I wasn't that silly. But what I objected to was the treatment inside there. The treatment we were subjected to, and you really see the cold face of racism in there. You're called a filthy name every day of your life. Every single day. You cannot escape it. You get times where I got put in a cage for 3 years and 8 months. I got put in underground cells simply because I gave black power salutes. You know, white prisoners used to get solitary confinement for hitting a screw. I give a black power salute, I'm down in the underground cells on bread and water. You know, this is in your face every day, but there's another thing that came out of that. I learnt the cold face of racism right there. So, in a way, I did forge my politics in Bogger Road, so they could do what they liked to me, but I beat them in the long run. On the other issues of mass migration, I don't see any issues of people coming to this country. I think the damage was done in 1788, and I think from then on we haven't got the right. The first people didn't bother knocking on the door. People are actually asking to come in here. People are coming in by boats, but they're still going through some form of process to get here. They're escaping from war-torn land. The autocracy that chose to come here after the initial invasion did not knock on the door. They did not ask permission. They slaughtered people. MacArthur was a great example. He was a direct result of him and Judge Advocate Collins. Their actions was the direct result of the total annihilation of the Tarawal people out southwest of Sydney. So when I think of migration, I think of not these hordes of people that are coming here. I think the hordes already came. And we're down to 2.7% of the population. We don't even get a say in this. We don't get a say. And this is the sad thing. We are First Nations people. We're not even asked an opinion. You ask an opinion now, but you get a politician to ask an opinion. They will not ask me how I feel. I have said before for refugees, you give me sovereignty to the Bidjar countries and we can take people out of Manus Island, they can come and live with me. That's it.
Yeah, it is racist to blame problems of infrastructure and public transport and healthcare systems and education systems on migrants, because they're not responsible for the fact that governments in this country don't want to provide proper public services because they're in hock to private companies for profit-making motives. I mean, it's definitely not the fault of migrants. Australia is a large country. Frankly, I would rather it become blacker sooner, and possibly there'd be a chance to overturn white supremacy in this country if that was the case. The big problem with migration is that there's one message that most migrants hear, and that is the fastest way to get along in Australian society is to act as white as possible. John Stratton, the cultural theorist from Perth, called it honorary whiteness. But he says the problem with honorary whiteness is that it can always be taken away from you because it's only honorary, it's not real whiteness. So you can behave in the way that you think that you're supposed to behave and do all of that kind of stuff, and then one day that can be whipped out from under you as fast as anything. So I would argue that the first thing that migrants need to do, and it really struck me when I moved here, the first thing that they need to do is educate themselves on invasion and on Aboriginal dispossession. It really struck me that the majority of migrants, wherever they come from in the world, have no clue what country they're migrating to. For them, Australia is like neighbours or home and away. You know, that's what they think Australia is. And I think it is on individuals to educate themselves about what they've bought into. And the fact that you are signing up to colonize nations by migrating to this country, it doesn't mean you can't live here, but you have to own up to that, right? So that's what I would have to say about migration. Yeah, you're right, anti-Semitism is used by the Israeli state to cover up for, you know, the occupation of the Palestinian people. At the same time, I don't think that we should discount that anti-Semitism exists. And one of the major ways, and I've said this in another talk that I gave at Sydney Uni, one of the major ways in which anti-Semitism exists is by forcing all of Jewish people to be associated with Israel, right? I'm an anti-Zionist Jew. I don't, it's anti-Semitic to force me to speak, to have an opinion about Israel, okay? It's part of the infrastructure of racism. And so we need to understand that it exists. And there are also actual attacks that happen on Jews just for the fact of their being Jewish. But at the same time, it is manipulated by governments and other agendas for very, very nefarious purposes.
Thank you for the speech tonight. I enjoyed it. First, I'd like to say no one can be happy about what happened to Australia's Indigenous people in the past. The destruction of their culture, that's always a sad thing. But for me, tonight wasn't about race, shouldn't have been about race. It should have been about class. But for me, the class question is the British ruling classes destroyed, raped and pillaged Scotland. Then they went to Wales and they raped and pillaged the Welsh. And to Ireland, they raped and pillaged the Irish, all white people. Then they even raped and pillaged the poorest of their own English people. Then they sent the convicts, the white convicts here, who they raped and pillaged as convicts. Exactly, irrespective of race. And in the 40s, the young English kiddies from the orphanage were brought out here, little 5, 10-year-old children, and the pedophiles got to them in their homes. They were here and they were raped, and some were murdered. So it was interesting to note that you glossed over all of this. You were predominantly focused on white against black. But I put it to you that the British imperialism is the problem, rather than race is a symptom of British imperialism in its expansionist phase, empire building. And the ruling classes are all European, of course, so that they're white there, but the ruling class don't discriminate on race. They'll exploit everyone, irrespective of their race. Just one more point. The fact that you didn't cover this aspect of the white against white, surely it's not because white lives don't matter.
I appreciate your points, but I came to speak at a topic called white supremacy in Australia. And I came to talk from an Indigenous point of view, and I know everything that happened. I too have an Irish ancestry, which I'm very proud of. I know when the Welsh got that over, I know when the Scottish got over, but I find this every time I talk about Aboriginal people being slaughtered by the British in this country, there's always talk about what happened somewhere else. And I do appreciate that, and I do know these things happen, and I do know there has been white against white. Why I mentioned before, I don't like using the term white privilege because it doesn't always exist. I also learnt that in prison. A lot of the St. Bernardo's boys that were chucked out here as kids and raped and terrorised and killed and in prison for a long time were in Bogger Road Jail too. But I'm here to talk from the point of view of an Aboriginal person who's been on the receiving end of white racism for 65 years. And if I diversify, I'm taking away from the very fact of the atrocities that were committed against my people. I can acknowledge, and I will acknowledge, and I will never back away from the fact that the British Empire has been one of the bloodiest terrorist organisations globally that ever existed. And I do have time, and I do speak at other organisations. As a matter of fact, when I ran from the Senate, one of the biggest votes I got was the Irish Bloc here in Sydney. simply because we have made over the years, we have made over the years many good camaraderie about similar grounds. We were invaded by the murderous British. But that's not what I'm here to talk about tonight. I'm afraid I was asked to speak about white supremacy from an Aboriginal point of view as an Aboriginal activist. And that's what I'll stick to, because if I talk about anything else, I then have to get onto a whole lot of other subjects, and I take away from the fact that there were over 5 million people living here prior to 1788, and by 1850 it was down to 50,000. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just comment briefly. I mean, I think I said it quite clearly that whiteness is a structure, and therefore we're all, just like gender is a structure that oppresses everybody, okay, whether we like it or not, whiteness is a structure that oppresses everybody, and that's why we need to dismantle whiteness. And people who benefit from being white can also participate in dismantling that structure by rejecting the benefits that accrue due to whiteness. And the historical points that you mentioned are correct, but what you didn't mention is that very soon after being released from convicthood or whatever, the former convicts were given pieces of land that did not belong to them. And that was the start of the spread of racial terror throughout this continent. And so nobody, and present-day migrants also, who I just spoke about before, is exempt from colonization. Everybody participates in colonization. Doesn't mean that they might not be oppressed on other axes, poverty, sexuality, gender, whatever it might be. But we're all here participating in colonization by migrating or having come as occupiers to this country, and that includes the convicts. So we just need to call a spade, and as soon as we depersonalize it by not taking personal offense, this is what I spent 3/4 of my talk talking about, not taking personal offense of pointing out historical facts and contemporary realities, then I think we'd all do better at moving forward together towards a better future.
I'm really sorry, but the agreement, I'm sorry, Jim, the agreement I've got with the Gaelic Club tonight, and I have to stick with it, is that we finish now. So maybe we just need to get off the stage. Maybe if Alana and Ken are in agreement, the conversation can continue around the tables. If, Jim, you want to put your question. But no, Jim, I actually have to get off the stage. So we're off the stage now, and because that's the agreement I made with the Gaelic Club. Yeah, okay. So thanks, everybody, and please put your hands together and thank Ken and Alana for a great speech.